Mass consumption economy, the glorification of business. Business became almost like a religion. The Man Nobody Knows by Bruce Barton became a top-selling book in 1925. He called Jesus the first modern businessman. He's quoted, "Picked up 12 men from the bottom of society and forged an organization that conquered the world." He is also quoted as saying, "Every advertising man ought to study the parables of Jesus. They are marvelously condensed and all good, and as all good advertising should be." Calvin Coolidge was also quoted, "The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there." Businessmen were considered the people that ruled the nation. The booming economy. The U.S. came out of World War I the world's largest creditor nation. There was a brief depression in 1920 to 1921. Andrew Mellon's trickled-down tax policies favored the rapid expansion of capital investment. Buying on credit became another innovative feature of the post-war economy. Between 1922 and 1928, industrial productivity rose 70%. Wages were also at an all-time high. Electric power increased 19-fold between 1912 and 1929. Before World War I, 20% of homes had electricity. By 1930, 70%. Refrigerators also became in vogue with vacuum cleaners and electric stoves. New technology also created greater efficiency, the electric motor and the assembly line, for example. New industries also developed. Light metal, aluminum, synthetics, movies, radio manufacturing, and the auto industry became king. Inventions. The telephoto and the television were not widely available until 1947, however. There were medical breakthroughs, including the iron lung, which was a respirator that cured TB and smallpox. The life expectancy in 1910 was about 49 years. In 1930, it grew to 59 years. Construction. Skyscrapers began to change the horizon of major cities. The Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world at 102 stories. There was also the first transatlantic telephone. Corporate revolution. Mergers continued at a furious pace in the 1920s. Chain stores became common, i.e. Sears and Roebuck. The managerial revolution. Corporate leadership began to be controlled by college-trained replaceable managers rather than the build the company from the ground up Henry Ford types. Business schools began to open up on college campuses around the world. New white-collar workers. In 1920 to 1930, white-collar jobs rose 38.1%, from 10.5 million to 14.5 million. Manual labor jobs were up only about 7.9%, 28.5 million to 30.7 million. There was also a huge increase in the number of consumer products, which created a need for advertising and salespeople. Women were increasingly entering the workforce. Typewriters, invented by the Remington Company in 1874, became significant. Almost all typists were middle-class, high school educated, and female. Women also became teachers, shop clerks, cashiers, and switchboard operators. Yet 57% of female workforce was comprised of black and foreign-born women, mostly in domestic service jobs. Advertising emerged as a new industry. American manufacturers seemed to have mastered problems of production and were now more concerned about finding mass markets for their goods. A typical worker was the young white college grad or a former newspaper writer. Men outnumbered women 10 to 1. They used persuasion, allure, and sexual suggestion. Sports became big business. Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey became household names due to image making. Fans bought tickets in such numbers that Yankee Stadium became known as the house that Ruth built. In 1921, heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey knocked out French lightweight George Carpentier and attracted the first in a series of million-dollar gates. Scientific management. Frederick W. Taylor started a movement to develop more efficient working methods to increase productivity, which eventually led to increased wages, which also increased profits. The principles of scientific management became very influential. The auto industry accepted it right away, especially Henry Ford. There were no established regulations. Workers hated Taylorism as it concentrated power in the production process to managers rather than workers and initially resulted in lower wages. Henry Ford and the assembly line. Detroit emerged as the automobile capital of the world. In the 1890s, Americans began to adapt the European gasoline engine to the making of cars. By 1910, 69 companies existed with a total annual production of 181,000 units. By 1929, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler made 83% of vehicles, the Big Three. Ford realized workers were also consumers. In 1914, he raised worker salaries from $2 a day to $5 if workers adopted thrifty habits. Ford paid good benefits. He hired handicapped, convicts, and immigrants. Ford was called a traitor to his class by many wealthy people. Ford's use of the assembly line made him about $25,000 a day throughout the 1920s. It took only 1 hour and a half to build a car. Before the assembly line, it took about 14 hours. The Model T became the staple car in America for many years. By 1930, Americans owned about 30 million cars, 20 million Model Ts. The drawback, however, the work was incredibly tedious. The machine was often set to pace. The automobile's impact. It replaced the steel industry as the king of industry in America. It employed about 6 million people by 1930, supporting industries such as rubber, glass, fabrics, and highway construction, and thousands of service stations and garages. Nation's standard of living also improved. The railroad industry decimated by passenger cars, buses, and trucks. Speedy marketing of perishable foodstuffs were also accelerated. A new network of highways emerged. 387,000 miles were made in 1921, and it grew to about 662,000 miles in 1929. Leisure time spent traveling allowed the opening up to new spaces. Isolation among sections broke down while less attractive states and lost population at an alarming rate. Buses made possible consolidation of schools and to some extent churches. Sprawling suburbs spread out even further as America became a nation of commuters. 1 million Americans had died in car accidents by 1951, more than all killed in America's battles hitherto. The airplane. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, flew a gasoline-powered plane 12 seconds and 120 feet at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Airplanes were used with some success for various purposes during World War I. Shortly after the war, passenger lines with airmail contracts came into being. By the 1930s and 1940s, travel by air on regularly scheduled airlines was markedly safer than on many overcrowded highways. By 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew the first solo flight across the Atlantic. The Spirit of St. Louis flew from New York to Paris in 39 hours and 39 minutes. Lindbergh became an American icon and a world hero. The impact of the airplane. Civilization became more closely linked. Railroads received yet another setback as planes stole passengers and mail service. Airplanes used with devastating effects on cities also during World War II. The radio. Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian, invented wireless telegraphy in the 1890s. The first voice-carrying radio came in November 1920 when KDKA in Pittsburgh carried the news of the Harding landslide. Later, transatlantic wireless photographs, radio, telephones, and TV emerged. The National Broadcasting Corporation was organized in 1926. The Columbia Broadcasting Company was forged also in 1927. The impact of the radio. It created a new bustling industry. It added to American life as leisure hours were filled with listening to programs. The nation was also more closely knit. Advertising became perfected as an art. Sports further stimulated the radio industry. Politicians used the airwaves to garner votes. Newscasts also informed millions of listeners of daily news updates. Music of famous artists and symphony orchestras also beamed into homes through the radio. The emergence of the movie industry. The first real moving picture was created in 1903 when the first story sequence reached the screen. The first full-length classic was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in 1950, which glorified the KKK and defamed the blacks. Movies got a tremendous boost as anti-German propaganda during World War I. Hollywood became the movie capital of the world. In 1927, the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, featured Al Jolson in blackface. By 1930, some color films were being produced. The impact of the movies. It eclipsed all other new forms of amusement. It became a new major industry employing about 325,000 people in 1930. Actors and actresses, some with huge salaries, became more popular than the nation's political leaders. American culture bound more closely together as movies became the standard for taste, styles, songs, and morals. It also provided education through informative shorts such as newsreels and travelogues. The changes in working conditions. There was a reduction in hours. In 1923, U.S. Steel offered its workers 3 8-hour shifts instead of a 12-hour shift, partially because of pressure from Harding. By the mid-1920s, steel making was so efficient that workers were given more time off. Welfare capitalism, an American plan of business. If workers are taken care of, no unions or strikes would be needed. The only flaw, however, was that unions could not compete with industrial prosperity, so that wages were not raised significantly. Social life in the Roaring Twenties. The census of 1920 revealed for the first time that Americans no longer lived in the countryside, but in urban areas. There was a sexual revolution. Theories of Dr. Sigmund Freud's mistakenly interpreted by Americans that sexual repression was responsible for a variety of nervous emotional ills. The flaming youth of the Jazz Age emphasized sexual promiscuity and drinking, as well as new forms of dancing considered erotic by the older generation. although illegal.